what we have seen is a pretty methodical effort by the Ukrainians, both to probe Russian defenses, not simply to mount a all-out D-Day style assault, and that I think will prove ultimately to be a smart strategy. And as we're seeing in the last couple of weeks, the Ukrainians are making progress in some critical points, and that obviously is heartening here in Washington as well as across Western European capitals.
Let's move to the East, as in we're talking Eastern Europe now, although the US is still involved because the United States has announced it will send controversial weapons to Ukraine as part of more than $1 billion in military and humanitarian aid. Russia has condemned the move to equip US Abrams tanks with shells strong enough to pierce conventional tank armor. They're made of depleted uranium, a byproduct of uranium enrichment, stripped of most of radioactive material. The announcement of this new security package for Ukraine came during top US diplomat Antony Blinken's visit to Kyiv, prompting that angry Russian response. Well, let's talk to Bruen, who's president of the Global Situation Room and a former White House Global Engagement Director under President Obama. Brett, hello.
Good to be with you.
This is interesting because Antony Blinken actually spent the night in Kyiv. He stayed 2 days. Explain just how significant that was and what we can read into this weapons package.
Well, first, I think the overnight as well as the McDonald's French fries that he shared with his Ukrainian counterpart were designed to be a signal of defiance to Moscow that the U.S. and more importantly, Ukraine still stood strong. And despite everything that Vladimir Putin is throwing at this conquest of Ukraine, it's not working, and a sense of modicum of normalcy is returning. I think more importantly, though, as you mentioned, it's the supersized arms package that Blinken announced, which was really important and obviously comes at a critical time with Ukraine trying to gain ground in their counteroffensive.
How much of a vote of confidence is this by the US or from the US in what Ukraine is doing? Because after the initial early promise, then over the last couple of months, there's been concern that this counteroffensive isn't going the way some had hoped.
Well, look, it's funny how many armchair military strategists pop up around the world. And ultimately, what we have seen is a pretty methodical effort by the Ukrainians, both to probe Russian defenses, not simply to mount a all-out D-Day style assault, and that I think will prove ultimately to be a smart strategy. And as we're seeing in the last couple of weeks, the Ukrainians are making progress in some critical points, and that obviously is heartening here in Washington as well as across Western European capitals.
And what about the attack on a place called Konstantinivka, I think the name is? That was the town in the east of the country, nearly 12 miles from the front line, and a Russian shelling killing at least 16 people and wounding dozens. I presume that was done to say to Blinken, we know you're in town and we don't care.
Well, and there have been multiple examples of these attacks on both civilian infrastructure as well as civilians themselves, which run contrary to the laws of war. They run contrary to just basic human values that we all supposedly share. And yet, I think what Vladimir Putin is trying to say is, I don't care. And, you can visit all you want. You can talk about all of the principles of democracy that you want. But ultimately, I am going to brutally take the land, and I am going to mount an effort irrespective of what the human cost is.
And the clock is ticking. I mean, the US may have a new president, a different president, in a year and a half's time. How, I suppose, much pressure is that putting on this White House, as well as the Ukrainians, given that Donald Trump, or indeed the other front runners, Vivek Ramaswamy, the new kid on the block, as it were, take a very different view. Trump says, I can get this sorted within 24 hours. And Ramaswamy kind of says, well, leave Putin with what he's got.
Yeah, and I think we only need to look as far as North Korea to assess Donald Trump's negotiating skills when it comes to these really challenging global issues. But more importantly is what is happening in Europe and how both in the UK as well as the rest of the NATO alliance, you are, or in many cases, are not seeing preparations for what it could look like if Joe Biden isn't in the White House. If you do have Donald Trump 2.0 or Vivek Ramaswamy or others who may be less inclined to provide as robust support as we've seen under President Biden. And that, I think, is unfortunately a very real scenario that we need contingency plans for. You simply don't have the defense production capabilities. You don't have the investment in defense that would be necessary for the Ukrainians just to sustain where they are right now, let alone to continue their counterattack.
So what are you saying? Are you saying that the likes of the Germans, the French, the UK and others, the Poles, need to scale up? They need to build their armaments and send more weapons at this point, even though Dmitry Peskov, the Russian spokesman, says it looks as though the West or the US are willing to wage this war, to fund this war to the last Ukrainian. And the bloodshed on the Ukrainian side is growing.
I think that's precisely right. We need to see, obviously, the UK has done a tremendous amount. We need to see other large European countries like the Germans, the French. We've obviously seen efforts from the likes of Italy, Spain, but we need more. And there has to be an effort to understand, to prepare for what happens if the United States is no longer providing support at the same level. And obviously just in some of the other issues around the world, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's what's happening across Africa, we need more defense capabilities. Europe cannot continue to shirk its responsibilities when it comes to providing the size and scale of support that these conflicts require.
All right, Brett Bruen, President of the Global Situation Room and former White House Global Engagement Director under President Obama, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Times Radio.